Richard Nixon grew up in a house where fun had rules, words had rules, even silence had rules. You might picture him as the man on the television screen, the president caught in a scandal, or the elder statesman writing memoirs. But before he was any of those things, he was a boy in Whittier, California, sitting on a hard bench, listening to prayer, and watching adults who believed God was not a Sunday hobby. In the Nixon home, God was the center of the week. Richard didn't get to drift. He didn't get to kind of believe. He lived inside a faith that measured you by what you did when nobody was watching. If you don't know this part of his life, you end up thinking Nixon was born cold, secretive, or hard to read. But if you look closer, you see the machinery that built him. A strict evangelical Quaker home that demanded discipline, preached pacifism, and pushed moral rigor every single day. This was not a casual religion. It was a routine, a fence, and a mirror. The story starts before Richard ever made a speech, with a marriage that required a sacrifice. His mother, Hannah Milhouse, was a devout Quaker from a long-time Quaker family, quiet, serious, and steady. Her faith wasn't loud, but it was deep, setting the expectations for the whole home. Her husband, Frank Nixon, was different. He grew up Methodist and had an emotional, shouting style. That difference in temperament could have split them. Instead, they made a choice that defined their children. Frank converted to Quakerism to marry Hannah. When they met at a Whittier Quaker meeting in 1908, Hannah's family expected a certain kind of union. For an interfaith marriage to work in her world, Frank had to align with her Orthodox faith. So, before their 1909 marriage, Frank changed his religious identity. This wasn't just a box he checked on a form. It changed how the household ran, what the children were taught, and what was allowed or banned. Frank didn't convert with a shrug. He embraced it enthusiastically, eventually teaching Sunday school. This conversion became part of his identity, bridging the gap between his outgoing nature and Hannah's quiet reserve. But it also created a home where religion dominated daily routines. The Nixon family practiced an evangelical branch of Quakerism that wasn't the soft, gentle version people often imagine. It involved daily prayers, multiple Sunday services, and revival attendance. For a child, this meant your week was built around worship, and your social life was filtered through rules. And the rules were tight. Dancing, swearing, and alcohol were banned. A child learns fast that the body has limits, the mouth has limits, and pleasure has limits. You can't just do what other kids do. You can't blend in. That creates a kind of inward life. It can make a person private because privacy becomes the only safe place. This is where Nixon's personality began to form. He grew up in a tension between quiet reflection and fervent worship. On one side, you sit still and examine yourself for right and wrong. On the other, you attend revivals and feel the heat of preaching. Nixon absorbed both currents. It fostered a private reserve at home and a public confidence in roles he was trained to handle. As a young adult, he taught Sunday school himself. That wasn't just passive attendance. It was him learning to guide others and present a moral message. He even claimed a teenage conversion to Christ. In a strict home, that kind of claim is a statement of belonging, a moment where a young person says, "This is mine, not just my parents." But the story doesn't stay clean. Life hit the family hard. Tragedy arrived, not as a metaphor, but as a disease. Nixon's younger brother Arthur died suddenly in 1925 from tubercular meningitis. He was only 7. The illness moved fast. A headache turned into a rapid decline. 12-year-old Richard broke down and cried every day for weeks. He worried about his own health, fearing a spot on his lung was the same killer. Arthur's death deepened Richard's bond with his mother as he watched her grieve. Hannah responded to the loss with an iron kind of faith, seeing it as God's will. Frank, however, felt punished. That difference in their parents' reactions mattered. In this home, pain did not lead to chaos. It led to interpretation. Was it God's will? Was it a verdict? Either way, it drove people inward. But the tragedy wasn't over. Nixon's eldest brother, Harold, battled tuberculosis for years. This wasn't a sudden shock. It was a long siege. In 1930, Hannah moved with Harold to Arizona for treatment, uprooting the family dynamic. Harold, the golden boy, died on March 7, 1930, at the age of 23. Richard was 17. He had to shoulder farm duties and quit football, effectively trading his youth for burden. He wept for weeks after Harold died, just as he had for Arthur. These losses fed a survivor guilt and a never-quit ethos in Nixon. If the home is hard and sickness keeps taking people, quitting feels like death. Winning and endurance become the only ways to feel control. Nixon buried his joyous side and grew into a man who often looked alone, even in crowds. But Nixon isn't an island. While his immediate family shaped his psychology, his bloodline connects him to a much wider American story. Richard Nixon shares an early New England settler ancestor, Thomas Cornell, with both Jimmy Carter and Bill Gates. This one family line ties a Republican president, a Democrat president, and a tech mogul together. Thomas Cornell was born in England around 1595 and settled in Portsmouth, Rhode Island. He wasn't a king or a noble. He was a man who got into land disputes and had 10 children. Those 10 children are why he matters. They created a family tree that kept branching until it touched the modern world in unexpected places. Cornell's life wasn't quiet. His wife, Sarah Fear, faced a witchcraft trial in 1671. She was acquitted, but the fact that she was accused shows the danger and fear that existed in their world. Nixon descends from Thomas Cornell through his mother, Hannah Milhouse. This makes Nixon and Jimmy Carter 6th cousins. It's a distant link, but a defined one. Bill Gates connects as Nixon's 9th cousin 5 times removed. The same early settler sits behind all 3, like a shared shadow. This ancestry forces you to see Nixon differently. He isn't just a figure on one side of the political map. He is tied by blood to his rivals and to the future of technology. Back in the 20th century, Nixon's mother, Hannah, was trying to give her sons something larger than their circumstances. She chose names that sounded like armor. She named her sons Harold, Richard, Donald, Arthur, and Edward. These were not gentle names, they were crowns. Richard was linked to Richard the Lionheart, Harold to Harold Godwinson, Arthur to the legendary king. Hannah lived with farm failure, illness, and death, yet she insisted on names that reached back to English history and grandeur. She wanted her sons to carry legacy and purpose, not just survive. In a poor home, hope has to be built, and Hannah created it with names. Richard grew up hearing this roll call of brothers like a tiny royal court, even as tuberculosis took 2 of them away. That contrast between the grandeur of his name and the reality of his loss made him determined. It fueled a drive to rise, to be taken seriously, and to chase history. As Nixon moved into adulthood, the tension between his mother's values and his own ambition became the defining conflict of his life. Hannah was a Quaker saint who believed in pacifism, truthfulness, and humility. Her son became famous for hard-edged tactics and secrecy. The first big clash came with World War II. Quakers are pacifists who refuse violence. Nixon served in the U.S. Navy, justifying it as necessary. That word, necessary, became the key to his life. Hannah's faith demanded a straight line. Nixon learned to draw angles. He didn't reject his mother. He built a selective piety. He held on to the parts of faith that made him look grounded while stepping around the parts that blocked his goals. He deflected questions about his faith by pointing to Hannah's piety, as if her purity could cover his gaps. He crafted a private Quakerism that was vague enough to avoid hard questions about pacifism or race. This vagueness helped him dodge scrutiny and eventually enabled cover-ups. When he became president, this internal conflict played out on the world stage. Hannah's pacifism clashed with his escalation of the war in Vietnam and the bombing of Cambodia. Quakers protested, seeing his peace through war strategy as the opposite of their faith. Nixon navigated this by framing his ambition as service. If he could label his drive as service, then ambition became a virtue. But the strain of living two lives, the moral Quaker and the ruthless politician, took its toll. The never-quit resilience he learned from his brother's deaths helped him survive political defeats, but his habit of hiding emotions eventually turned into hiding facts. Secrecy became a tool. The man who was trained to control his face, to survive a volatile father and a strict religious community, learned to control the story. This is where Watergate enters the story, not just as a crime, but as a collapse of this carefully built structure. The data suggests that the deceit of Watergate mirrored his early habits of avoiding direct truth and sidestepping accountability. In childhood, strict rules can train you to hide failure. In the presidency, hiding becomes a scandal. The penalty for not knowing this background is that you never understand why Nixon's fall felt like more than politics. It felt like a betrayal. The boy who taught Sunday school and avoided vices became the man caught on tapes swearing and giving violent orders like, "Bomb the shit out of them!" He drank heavily, sometimes becoming loud or aggressive. People judged him not just for what he did, but for what he claimed to be. The distance between the Quaker saint, mother he honored, and the tapes that revealed his private rage was too wide to ignore. Yet, even in his fall, the Quaker influence remained. Nixon's peacemaking efforts, like the opening to China and détente, were driven by the same moral legacy that fueled his ambition. Hannah's influence may have pushed him toward deals that reduced global tension even as he escalated war elsewhere. The connection is a knot. Hannah's faith gave him duty and resilience, but her standard of truthfulness created a pressure he couldn't meet, leading him to hide more, not less. In 1989, near the end of his life, Nixon sat with a biographer and said, "The impact of my Quaker heritage on my personality has been underestimated." He wasn't trying to make himself look good. He was trying to explain the machinery. He wanted the world to see that his reserve wasn't just coldness, it was a form of silent reflection he had practiced since childhood. He wanted them to see that his resilience was built on the graves of his brothers, not just political ego. He had spent his life trying to look unshakable, a man who could hold the tension without showing it. He put his hand on his mother's Bibles to take the oath of office, trying to tie himself to her purity. But a man can borrow the language of faith without being able to borrow its protection forever. Nixon's story is often remembered as a tragedy of power, but if you look at the boy in Whittier, the losses he endured, and the strict faith that both anchored and trapped him, you see a different tragedy. It is the story of a man who built a wall to survive his own life, and then found himself trapped behind it. The same heritage that taught him to endure also taught him to conceal, and that mix left an old man in 1989 still arguing with history, trying to tell us that we never really saw him at all.